Tonight, we're talking about a topic which I think is incredibly important. It's pretty difficult these days to understate how important it is to take action on climate change. On this depends so many of the causes that Fabians holds dear to its heart. Without action, which results in net zero by 2030, we already know that we'll be locked into 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. We can't be sure of how many people will directly die or suffer from this, but what we can be sure of is that all of those issues dear to Fabians' hearts, that inequality will increase, populations will be forced to consolidate into climate-friendly zones, social competition for resources will also increase, and as a result, maintaining stable governments will become harder and politics will probably become tougher and nastier. Demands on the public purse for reparation for loss and damage from climate events are likely to eat up budgets for care, education, health, and health is also likely to be worse given less water, crop failure, more likelihood of epidemics and new diseases, on top of direct heat effects on health. It's a depressing litany of ills, and the list seems to just get longer every time that more research is done. While most of us feel pretty disempowered and a bit overly challenged by the magnitude of the problem, there are some people who devote their lives to fixing it. Bruce Mountain is one of those people. Bruce has combined qualifications of electrical engineering from the University of Cape Town with his English qualifications as a chartered management accountant to embark on a career analysing energy market regulation. In Australia, he capped this with a PhD from Victoria University on the political economy of energy regulation in Australia. He's now a professor in that same university where he runs the Victoria Energy Policy Centre and Research Centre rather. And if you want to read some of his research, a good starting point is looking at its website. Bruce has been a long-standing advisor to governments. He's been an advisor to regulators, market participants and interest groups in Australia and internationally. In particular, he's done a lot of work behind the scenes in Victoria, advising the Victorian government on energy policy. But you might have also seen him occasionally in front of cameras or heard him on radio. He's a noted commentator on energy policy. So tonight you have an opportunity to hear more about this, so I'll ask you to please welcome Bruce.
Thank you, Julia. It's a delight to be here. It's an honour to be here. I had a look at the previous guests at this dinner, such well-known names, Mr. Barry Jones, Mr. Jeff Gullop, Ross Garno, and Jill Triggs, who I saw treated incredibly harshly by a government and stood up to it with valour and honour, and I thought, what a fantastic event to be asked to speak to. So I am delighted. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julia. Also, as I was walking here, I passed a college, I can't recall which one, and it had a sign, "Search for the truth and do justice." And I thought, well, that's a sign from the heavens about what the Fabians are about and exactly what I feel about. So there's a great meeting of minds, and again, I'm so pleased to be here. I feel that I am at home. So with that, let me get on to the meat of my talk. I wish I could change that slide so that you didn't have to look at me twice. We need to decarbonise, and we need to do it fast. This means switching power in our homes, workplaces and personal transport to clean energy. What are the challenges in this, and what are the hard problems that we need to face? And are there ways to transition without jeopardising equity and fairness? So I'm going to unpack this in some order, and I'm going to end with the challenges and the difficulties. I wish I could say that there was a magic wand, but there are really difficult problems of equity and fairness that arise if we don't deal with the challenge, but there are also big ones that arise as we do. So, what does decarbonisation of energy supply mean? Well, it means two things. We need to electrify, which means we need to switch away from gas, the alternative fuel that we use in our homes and businesses. Coal has very limited use. We need to move away from oil for our transport, and we need to switch not just to electricity but to clean electricity, which in Australia means the wind and sun, a little bit of biomass, a little bit of hydro, no meaningful scope to build it out further. What does electrification mean? It means, first of all, heat pumps for low temperature heat, for heating water and heating spaces. About 60% of the gas that Australia uses in our homes is for heating spaces in winter in Victoria and for heating water. And we need to move away from gas for that. We also need to move away from gas and its use in heavy industry for high temperature heat. We need to move away from gas in cooking, but that doesn't mean much for climate change. It's a relatively small amount of gas use, but we nonetheless need to move away from it. And we need to move away from a combustion engine, burning diesel typically, but also fuels, other fuels, to DC motors. These are motors that have instantaneous motive force from the moment they move, which is why Teslas are so well known as being these phenomenally fast vehicles. Those are the three key technology shifts in the economy. When I say it like that, it all sounds so simple. Such a few shifts, why is it not easy? We will come to that. What does renewable electricity mean? Well, wind, solar, geothermal, wave possibly, hydro. Hydro is well developed globally. There's some pressure in Africa to extend it, but as we know, hydro does a great deal of damage to the environment. Wind and solar is moving on in leaps and bounds everywhere. Wave has been much spoken of as a force of energy that is there all the time, unlike the wind and the sun, which is variable, but has not got terribly far. And geothermal, utilising the heat in hot rocks, typically at 100 metres or more, very common in Iceland and Greenland, has had lots of research put into it, but has not got terribly far. So moving to clean energy is about the wind and sun. It's also about storage. Without storage, you cannot reuse the variable resource of the wind and sun. So the two go together. And we need storage both in stationary application to store the electricity that's generated and put back into our systems, and we need storage in our movable applications. Our cars, obviously, but our trucks and our trains and our buses and so on. So why bother with this? We all know of the existential crisis, which is the warming of the atmosphere in the oceans. So global warming is number one. The second reason is the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels has a number of nasty local effects which jeopardise health. And in fact, today I read an article, I think in the Economist, talking about how the death rate from coal had been greatly understated through air impacts and mercury and so on. Thirdly, electrical appliances often, but not always, give much better service than the others. And having just bought an EV, I feel my world of private transport has changed completely. It's all so simple and clean and usable. Fourthly, electricity, and most notably clean electricity, is often cheaper for energy users. I say often there is a transition and there's points at which it can become more expensive, and it's a terrifically complex issue which shouldn't be simplified, but we can say once the transition has occurred, we will be in for a much cheaper future. And finally, the transition stimulates economic activity. It creates opportunities for innovation, it creates opportunities to excel, it becomes a source of wealth and innovation and advantage, and all of those are excellent reasons to undertake the shift. So, if these arguments are so compelling, why is policy needed? Why is this so difficult? So, firstly, and I've got 6 reasons here, only a small part of the main benefit, avoiding dangerous climate change, is captured by those who invest in the shift. Climate change is the classical externality in economic terms, and when you make the changes, you personally only capture a small part of the climate change benefit. There are lots of other benefits, as I have said, that you can capture in the shift, but often the marginal cost does not exceed the marginal benefit that individual consumers and governments gain. Secondly, enormous amounts of capital need to be raised to make the energy shift happen. And sadly, even bigger amounts need to be raised because we have all, globally and in Australia, been so slow in adapting that now we need to make the change at a very rapid pace. And that brings on additional costs, not just in building infrastructure and clean energy quickly, but in the mustering of various sources of capital and skill that we now need to do at very great haste. Thirdly, clean energy, wind and solar, is variable. It's not, to use the jargon of the power industry, baseload. That means that you need to complement it with storage, or you need to complement it by shifting demand. And shifting demand puts individuals and companies and countries to a point of bother. You need to change the way you do things, and there's an economic cost in that, and that becomes part of the cost. Although the wind and sun produce electricity much more cheaply on a fully absorbed cost than the alternatives, because you need to store it, the aggregate of the cost rises as your power systems get cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, such that at current technologies, fully cleaning up the power system becomes incredibly expensive. We can get to 83% or thereabout, which is the federal government's target, without breaking in too much of a sweat, and we can be very confident electricity prices will move down if it's done reasonably well. But with current technology, getting beyond that, things become terribly expensive. Fourthly, clean energy has pretty severe local impacts on land use, on farmers. The second biggest consumer of land is power lines through the easements that they require, after roads, that is. That land is often sterilised. Some of it can be farmed to some degree, but it also cuts a swathe through state parks and national parks, doing a great deal of damage in the process. Those local impacts need to be mitigated and traded off against global gains. Fifthly, the shift creates losers, and they feel all of the loss now. Although we all share in the gain in the long term, the losers feel much more of the loss in the present, and so they stand in the way of progress. And finally, in the absence of policy, the transition is likely to be regressive. Because of all of these wealth effects and others, which I'm going to talk about shortly, unless governments have policies, it is the wealthy who will gain the most from the shift to clean energy, and the wealthy that stand to lose the least from the failure to shift. So, where do the regressive impacts originate? Firstly, general price effects and fuel poverty through the income-wealth inequality. And I'm going to talk about the various reasons for that. Although the future of clean energy is cheaper, there's a big investment and a big shift to be gone through to get there. Wealthier people and those with higher incomes are more likely to have access to resources that make it easier for them to take advantage of electricity and then of clean electricity. And I've spoken about my EV. Wherein lies the difference? Well, capital and income. If the transition demands capital, those who have capital have the ability to take advantage of it. But it arises in a number of other physical ways which are very difficult to deal with. The second is there's a very strong correlation between wealth and income and property ownership. The 6.5 out of 10 properties that are owned are mostly in the top half of the income distribution upwards. The 3 and a bit tenths properties that are not owned are mostly in the lowest 2 or 3 wealth levels. Coming with property ownership often is also a driveway and a garage. And who would ever thought that a driveway or a garage could be so valuable? But when you have an EV, your driveway or your garage is your petrol station. And having a driveway or garage means access to an EV becomes so very much easier. And a whole lot of the value of an EV is utilising electricity that you buy from the grid rather than paying 2 to 3 times the price at a fast charger. Fourthly, most of the wealth of owned houses is also in houses that are actually freestanding, that often have a north-facing roof. That makes all the difference. If you own your roof, if you can actually control your roof, you can put your own little way of making electricity on the roof, you can store electricity from it, and that gives you enormous advantage for your own electricity consumption and for your personal transport. Most people wouldn't know, for example, that the amount of energy that you use for heating water in your showers is enough energy to power your electric vehicle for the typical distance that an Aussie travels. So phenomenal energy is stored in that, and having the ability to utilise your own rooftop solar for that is a huge advantage. Fifthly, better insulated homes. Richer people have better insulated homes. They typically don't rent, and so they feel the benefit of the insulation. And finally, people who have semi-detached or homes that are actually freestanding typically also have free space around the property to put bulkier items, which are heat pumps for the heating of water or spaces, or batteries, and so on. So all of these intrinsic advantages accrue to those who have income or who have wealth. I'm going to switch now to a few slides, move on to where Australia and Victoria is on the energy transition journey. That's not it. No, that's not it.
That's what you can afford after you buy your EV.
Okay. Right. Here's a few slides. Should be coming up shortly. There it is. Okay. I don't know if you can see this in the back, so I'm going to talk to these slides. This is the last 11 years of electricity in the national electricity market from the wind, large-scale solar and small-scale solar on roofs. The orange bar is wind, and you can see it's grown roughly 4 to 5-fold over the last 13 years. The dark bars at the bottom is large-scale solar, and you can see that's grown, but not as much as the purple bars at the top, which is rooftop solar. The aggregate on the right-hand side is about 40% of the electricity in the national electricity market now comes from clean energy, wind and solar. At a country level, as an aggregate for a country, believe it or not, we are leading the world. We draw more electricity from the wind and the sun than any other country at a country level measure, which is quite incredible. And most of that great success is rooftop solar, where per capita we have by far the highest electricity production from rooftop solar in the world. So partly explained by our freestanding homes, excellent sun, very high electricity prices, and government policy to actually give it its credit. So that's the good news story. The slighter, less good news story is to put it in the context. The bottom bar, the blue bar at the bottom, is hydroelectricity. You can see it waves around a bit from year to year when there's a wet year or a dry year in the snowy mountains in Tassie. The purple bar above it is wind, as you can see from the previous slide, has grown. Large-scale solar, the orange bar that slices the wind and the hydro, and then natural gas, which you can pleasingly see is quite appreciably smaller, the purple bars on the right-hand side to the left. As we've transitioned out of coal, we haven't transitioned into gas, whereas many countries, Britain and elsewhere, have transitioned out of coal, they've transitioned into gas. The yellow is our black coal, which, although getting smaller, is still very big. And the greyish blue towards the top is brown coal in Victoria. And the orange at the top is the small-scale solar. So you can see a mix, a pleasing mix, nowhere near as pleasant as the first chart, where you can see a much greater expansion when you ignore the fossil fuels. Now, I'm pretty sure that not many of you can see this, so I'm going to read it. This is the electricity targets for clean energy, and I think this is for Asia. So this is Asia and its neighbours, right up at the top in terms of size. On the left-hand column, it's dominated by China, so don't pay too much mind to that. But on the right-hand side, you can see a grey dot and a green dot, which is the existing portion of energy from clean sources, and the green dot is the target. And Australia, pretty much in the middle of most of our Asian neighbours now, is in a similar position. When this chart was produced, it was 35%, now it's 40%. But the green dot, 83% clean energy by 2030, by comparison to our neighbours, Indonesia, China, India, we're far ahead. We're far ahead, much, much further ahead than our neighbours. This chart is of the OECD, and at the top is Iceland with geothermal, always had geothermal, and is a completely clean system. Then Estonia, going from relatively small amount to clean energy. And then Denmark, which has long had around half of its electricity production from wind, another 25% from biomass, the biggest non-hydro clean energy country, and it's getting close to 100%. And then Norway, long been a fully clean system hydro, Austria, Portugal, UK, Chile, Australia. Australia's right up there in the OECD group of countries with a 2032 target of clean energy. So by OECD measurements, we are doing very well. And when you look at the relative size of the grey to green dot, Australia's 2022 to 2030 target has the biggest absolute shift. So our governments have set very impressive targets. And finally, G20 countries, the UK at the top in terms of the green being the furthest to the right. We're in third place, almost matching the United Kingdom amongst the G20 rich countries. So we have made good progress, and we've set, or our governments have set, very impressive targets in international rankings. Let's talk a little bit about some of the equity and impacts of energy on income. As a proportion of the household income spent on electricity, gas, and other heating, when we compare Australia to the EU, looking at the lowest decile on the left-hand side, or that's the lowest quintile on the left-hand side, we're about 2/3 of the EU average. That's simply because our space heating demand is so much lower, and so our energy consumption is lower. And then when we look at the top quintile, Australia is a good deal lower than the EU. So there's a steeper income effect or share of income effect in Australia than we see in the EU. And to our good fortune, not having very cold winters has meant that relatively the income effects of energy are lower than we see in the EU. This is not a terribly good slide, but it's from a Melbourne University Roy Morgan research asking house owners and others to talk about whether they're unable to heat or cool their house to a comfortable level, the blue chart, or whether they're unable to pay their electricity and gas bills. Those who are stressed in the second column, those who are not stressed in the third, you see a difference, of course. You can see a income and age effect. The young and the less well-off, predictably, are less able to heat and cool their homes to a suitable temperature and find it more difficult to pay their bills. By global rankings, fuel poverty in Australia, even amongst rich countries, is nowhere near a bigger issue as it is in many European countries and many rich countries. So I'm going to end my talk by setting out some ideas. I said I was going to end with some challenges and difficult questions, but I'm going to set out, because I have the opportunity to grandstand, I'm going to set out a few suggestions. Firstly, underestimating the effect of innovation and technology change is a bad mistake. While everyone is seduced by long-term thinking, who wants to just think short-term? There is a price to be paid. As Keynes said, in the long term, we are all dead. And you can think long-term, but be very mindful of the mistakes that you make in that, in overestimating your own knowledge and in underestimating the rate at which technology has changed. There have been the most remarkable shifts in technology, in clean energy. Wind, in real terms, is a third the cost it was 12 years ago. Solar is a tenth the cost it was. Batteries have come down enormously in cost and still will. Secondly, and I have said this before, to fully decarbonise electricity supply. We all say 100% and we think in absolutes. It's often not terribly helpful to think in absolutes. Sometimes near enough is good enough. Or rather, the price to be paid for the perfect stands in the way of a lot of sensible change. And as I've said, the transition from 83% with current technology to 100% is going to be incredibly expensive. That does not mean we need to shift to gas now or even contemplate gas as a clean fuel for the end. But what I would like to encourage is pragmatic, realistic target setting. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and climb the foothills and then the mountains in that order. Thirdly, for governments, focus on consumers and individuals every bit as much or even more than on the industry. Policy advisors need to live life at 30,000 feet to have the big picture, but so much of the truth and the value, we all search for the truth. The truth is there to be found in the details, every bit as much or even more than at 30,000 feet. So spend as much time as you can worrying about individuals and consumers who are diverse and who are really where the issues become most important. Fourthly, and this is a income and a wealth equity issue, reducing costs by growing the industry is valuable. But the middle and upper income wealth cohorts are the early adopters. They have the willingness and the ability to pay. And that can, for those of us here, and I share your values, that can sit in your stomach. It is the wealthy who policymakers in the public interest are better off targeting first. Middle class welfare, terrible thing. There's an economic rationale to it. And in the energy transition, growing the industry, growing the value chain, growing the uptake of different technologies makes it cheaper for others. This is a difficult thing. And it's a difficult thing for those of us who are committed to opportunity and equity. And I don't have an easy answer, but it is true. Think of the Victorian government legislating to impose an EV tax. Terrible PR, terrible press, the worst EV tax in the world, it was called. But it costs me $2 to fill my EV with enough energy that would cost me $120 of petrol. And I'm using public infrastructure for next to nothing.
Yeah, I agree with the tax.
Yes,
I agree with the tax.
but when you put the tax in and you slow the uptake of the transition to EVs, you are undermining the transition that we need to see. So these are the difficult problems. There is no single right answer to it. These are the quandaries. Fifthly, addressing the physical impediments that come with wealth, like roof space, access to roof space, the ratio of roof space to floor space, which makes EV possible in freestanding homes but not in blocks of flats, or access to a driveway. Dealing with these difficulties to ensure access to clean energy by those who don't have these advantages is terrifically difficult. Making sure that street-level chargers are available for people living in blocks of flats so that they don't have the inconvenience or as much inconvenience of not just being able to easily plug in the charger and don't have great expense is difficult. Changing the rules for owners' corporation to ensure that individuals can access chargers within the shared property, these are terrifically difficult policy implementation challenges. It's hard work. And finally, and I think our governments have been, certainly the governments I know, certainly at a state level, and more recently at a, not always at a federal level, but certainly this one, have been very mindful of the wealth effects of the transition. And in the past, and have here, put in place a number of social transfers to achieve some level of equity. Those are essential. A whole lot of the difficult transition problems cannot be dealt with. They are just too hard to easily deal with. Unfortunately, wealth is a very significant variable which affects the ease of the energy transition. So social transfers will still be essential to smooth the path. So thank you very much for listening to me. I wish I had a wand to wave away all these problems. The best I can do is raise them, and I look forward to debate and discussion. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Bruce, for this amazing talk and so rich in information, and I'm sure everyone here is like their heads are just going very fast trying to process so much to think about and such difficult questions and so important ones. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Two questions. I did a napkin calculation about a year ago on how much solar there is and how much energy is consumed by production and everything, and there wasn't enough solar to create green electrons to cater for all our manufacturing, glass, steel and everything. So that's number one. Am I correct in my napkin? And number two, can you explain Peter Harcher's article in Saturday's Age? Because I didn't understand it fully. If you had read the article,
No, I haven't.
It was talking about that there's a lot of solar production during the day, and it drops the cost of electricity, which makes it harder for corporations to invest. So I read it twice.
Yes.
I didn't fully understand
Okay. 8% of Victoria's electricity comes from rooftop solar. Although per capita we have the highest power, it's only 8%. But we have, and these things have been counted many times, we have more roof space than we need on our homes and businesses to completely electrify the economy at least twice over. Fantastic shared roof space. Landlords want the income associated with it. Tenants want the cheap electricity. It's close to the point of load. So again, Australia, the lucky country, we have enormous opportunity to expand rooftop solar in businesses and homes. Secondly, there is a fantastic shared benefit of rooftop solar, and that is that it makes electricity when the sun shines and the sun moves across the day. It's peak in the middle of the day and then it declines. And so even though 8% is an average, in South Australia and at times in Victoria, almost the entire electrical demand is met through rooftop solar on people's homes, powering not just their homes, but infiltrating through the power system, meeting all the needs of the industry. That becomes a plentiful resource, and when things become plentiful, they become cheap. That creates enormous opportunity for industry to electrify by shifting their demand when it goes there. It has undermined investment in rooftop solar and in large-scale solar, much more so large-scale solar, because when you're selling something that's plentiful and the prices are cheap, you don't get the income necessary, which is the basis of the federal government's policy, which was announced yesterday, of a massive contracting arrangement to effectively have taxpayers bear much of the cost of the new investment that will occur. I think the cost should be sheeted back to consumers because we all get the benefit of electricity in due course, but it does mean that it's become very difficult for wind and solar investors to invest because they're selling into a market for something that at the margin is very plentiful and hence cheap.
Thanks, Bruce. That was very interesting. Back in 1975, Professor Charles Birch wrote Confronting the Future, claiming that we must immediately cut pollution or the planet, the soils, the air and the water will be ruined beyond repair in 1990. In 1979, 340 scientists met in the World Climate Council in Zurich and declared an emergency. This apparently all means nothing to nobody. I wonder if we had statesmen, if Menzies and Chifley were Prime Minister back in those days, would they say, well, we must immediately tax fossilised activities and as David Suzuki said 20 years ago, we're in a train doing 1,000 miles an hour, heading for a brick wall. We're looking at inequality beyond grotesque, and our daily activities we know are killing our grandchildren. And I'd just like to recommend that everybody sees Juice Media. They've just put out a brilliant expose on the brain dead. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you get the gist of it.
Bring Menzies back to life.
What's your comments on that?
Very briefly, I think all those who have drawn attention to the shared damage of the utilisation of our natural resources, I would say, have been proven right. In my field every day, the charts for the rate of change necessary to avoid 1.5 degrees, more than 1.5 degrees, have almost become vertical. And the ecological and climate impacts, to my mind, have been proven if not right on the conservative side, even by those who are thought to be out on the fringes. So that would be my view.
Thank you for your presentation this evening. It's been inspiring. I want to ask you a question concerning renewables and their installation by the Victorian government at the moment, which I commend in many respects, but I'm concerned in that they're looking to mow down a lot of forests in order to install renewables on high power tension lines. Have you done anything or had any conversations with the minister responsible and the premier in respect of putting them underground? Because my fear is that with renewables, which are commendable, and as you say, 8% are now installed by the good burgers around Victoria, that one will cancel out the other by mowing down forests.
Yes, this is something that we've worked extensively on. Electricity transmission is where I started my life, not life, but my working life at least, which has been my life. These electricity transmission lines that are proposed to cut through Western Victoria and then Northern Victoria and across to Sydney are extraordinarily problematic. I believe, and this is again comes back to the point I was making earlier on the detail, I believe we can avoid most of them, and we've put forward an alternative transmission expansion plan, which I believe can achieve the transition. We also encourage utilisation of this fantastic rooftop solar resource that we have, that we've barely scratched the surface of. These issues are hard technically, although that's not the reason that progress is slow. There are incredibly strong vested interests on every bit of the transition for and the transition against, and governments battle to deal with those. So even though better ideas are there to be had, it's a long, hard slog to prosecute them.
Bruce, that was a terrific exposition, and hopefully we can see that off your website and look at it off that after the discussion here tonight. But just thinking about the public consultations that have been initiated by both the Victorian and New South Wales governments on getting off gas, and those consultations have asked for community responses at a level of detail. Where do you think those processes go from here? Do you feel optimistic about them? Are there ingredients missing, or are they going to be, in their present condition, able to achieve a large part of what needs to happen now?
Yeah, the shift out of gas in industry and residential consumption is quite difficult. It's difficult because households need to make decisions to do things at a point in time that they otherwise wouldn't. Shifting over the heat pump, the heating of your water, and shifting over the space heating of your home. I did a very detailed study for the Victorian government 3 years ago, at the end of which I decided, having looked at the economics carefully and the incremental costs, to completely shift over my house. And I went through the process. It was relatively simple for me because I didn't have gas space heating, and so it was changing the water heater. And then my wife is very keen on cooking with gas, so I needed to get a gas bottle. But I could work through those things. But I'm applied in those fields. It requires a great deal of knowledge to get there. 2.5 million homes in Victoria. This is a major project management exercise. Capital needs to be arranged. And then you face very difficult regulatory issues associated with masses of gas pipeline infrastructure whose economics has made it infeasible to maintain and to and to keep on using. And now you need to provide solutions not just for the wealthier homes who can be induced to make these decisions, but for the blocks of flats who don't have easy access to heat pumps or body corporate owners corporation issues that impede the change. Each one of these are very big, detailed policy and implementation problems that our governments can deal with, but they are hard, and it's at that level of regulatory implementation that the challenges now lie. I would encourage you, however, in each of your own circumstances to, do the hard yards and figure out the switch over. Economically, you're bound to be better off as long as you don't need to replace many appliances. And those are some of the things that I think is an obligation of those that have the privilege. So we can make it easier in that sense, and I think continue to pressure governments without the pressure overcoming those difficult implementation challenges becomes all too easy for them to leave in the too hard basket.
Good evening. Is this close enough? Yes. In 2001, I bought into a very future-looking, environmentally friendly development in Brunswick. Since then, I have had to replace the gas for my heating, the gas for my hot water, and the gas for my cooking. How can we future-proof other developments that are really aiming to do the best by the environment, but for whom the science changes so rapidly that it is very unencouraging?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So heat pumps are the big water heating electrification opportunity. They work like a fridge. They heat a gas, which then cools again, and you extract the heat, or you can shift the heat. Because they get the heat, most of the energy from the air, they turn a little bit of energy into a very great amount of useful heat. There was an article in the papers recently that these heat pumps, which use hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, which are terrible greenhouse gases. Some of the best ones now use CO2, which is a bad greenhouse gas. There's a new innovation available that utilises minerals and resources. It's at the leading edge in research and it hasn't been implemented, but all of us that have made the switch to heat pumps, which have HFCs or CO2 as their coolant, are suddenly now saying, how do we future-proof? The answer is you can't. There will continue to be innovation, and long should there be, in batteries, in manufacturing, in clean energy devices that can be better recycled and better used. We can't get all the way there, but we can get a long way there. And I think it's better, again, not letting the enemy be the perfect of the good. These current technologies which are available can greatly decrease the greenhouse gases which each of us put into the atmosphere every year.
My name is Bruce Began. I'm from one of the rare things in this room. I'm actually a Western region farmer. And we're going to get the transmission lines right across our farm. We have read your paper, yours and Summer Parkland, isn't it?
Yes.
And every farmer I know in the region's read it as well, which shows that they're unnecessary in a lot of cases. Worse than that, I mean, these transmission wires, as you know, are taller than any building on this campus. And they're cutting across people's farms, their houses, they're within 100 metres of their houses, and some are going across the houses. They have electromagnetic fields under it, which AusNet, who's running all this, say if you put your hands up to the fluorescent globe, it will light up. But there's no danger, they tell us. There's no danger. I want to know how the hell we're supposed to negotiate with a government that doesn't want to talk to us. We've tried several times. and darling Lily won't talk to anyone. She's blinded by everything. But I want to know, if it's only 7 metres wide to put them underground, compared to 110 metres going through the forest and everything else, and where's Kenya? We've asked Kenya about the koala. She's too busy in Queensland looking after them. She's not interested in the great gliders. We've got them in our forests. She's not interested. And our properties are devalued to zilch. We had a real estate agent come in to us and said, basically, after we told him what was happening, they're coming diagonally across our property, it's worth $4 million. They said you might get between $500,000 and $1 million for the land. As far as your house and that, nobody will buy it at that price, because they would have. If the wire lines are there, nobody will buy it. And we can't get that across to WASNET, who say they won't go down government land, where there's easements down the side of the freeway for them, because they're told they won't go down government land. How do we fight a multinational corporation that tells us lies, has no social license, and they won't listen to the facts?
So I've lost a lot of sleep, genuinely have, over VNI West, this 500 kV transmission line cutting through Victoria. That little sign I saw, search for the truth and do justice, well, that's it. And you keep fighting. It's avoidable. This is the energy transition. This is what the energy transition looks like. Not just rah-rah, hockey sticks, we want the change, but deal with the difficult challenges that arise in the transition. Search for the truth and do justice. And the transition is going to happen effectively when we engage in it and do that. And to Jeff's earlier comments about transparency in government and the importance of openness, absolutely. And the rubber hits the road in energy transition in this in a big way. So keep on keeping on.
Yes, I wanted to ask you,
Just close to you.
The private corporations are not really interested in ecological solutions, mainly in terms of a bit of rhetoric. But I think what we should be probably doing is encouraging Labor governments to actually implement a program which would be a national program where the governments are involved in this transition. And I think you were saying that 80% of electricity is already produced in South Australia through rooftop solar energy, but I'm not sure if this is sufficient for all our needs. So I think Australia can store a lot of energy, particularly when you're at the middle of Australia. A lot of solar energy can be got through solar power.
Yeah. So there's a interesting issue in the energy transition now. Governments are now getting back into energy in a big way, having got out of it in a ownership sense in Victoria 25 years ago, and in other parts of the country more recently. They're now getting back into it in ownership and for to actually fund it. And most recently, the federal government announced a policy last week, which is the biggest shift in electricity policy in this country, certainly as far as I know, since the Second World War, since they set up electricity commissions. And that is that the federal government will contract for 23,000 megawatts of wind and solar capacity and 9,000 megawatts of battery, which will account for around a third of our electricity. So the government is now going to be not owning, but controlling much of the electricity production. And coming with that becomes an ability to impose tighter environmental and social standards. Our governments haven't always risen to that challenge, where state governments own electricity and they're not any cleaner. than where they've privatised. So hopefully in the transition they will impose higher standards. Generally, government is going to get very much more involved in every bit of electricity by virtue of the economics of the wind and sun.
Bruce, thank you. As I understood what you were saying, following up on that comment about solar and the value of rooftop generation, I had to say it could basically do twice what we need. How significant then is the policy for buyback tariffs as an incentive?
Yeah. So for typical households, about 2/3 of the value that you get from it is, in value in dollar terms, is from your own use of the electricity. Most particularly if you can shift your load into the time of the day that the sun is shining. Because once you've installed it, there's no cost associated with it. It's a free resource. And even before you've made the decision to install it, the average cost of production from your solar is about 1/4 to the 1/5 of what you would pay from the grid. But exporting electricity, the feed-in rate has been important to households, partly because $1 earned is valued more than $1 saved. So people, even though it's a relatively small value, they still value it, or small number, they still value it. But it's becoming less important as people can grow their consumption. And in my case, if I divert my rooftop solar into my EV, I've got completely free travel. But sustaining high feed-in tariffs, which is the price you get when you sell back to the grid, at the same time that the grid price is next to zero, because we've got plentiful resource at the same time that you're feeding back, economically becomes a problem. And it becomes an equity and a justice problem, because it's the wealthier in their detached homes with rooftop solar wanting an income that they get back from all customers, which implies greater social transfers to those that don't have solar to even it out. So again, one of these energy transition challenges. I think the rooftop solar has got so far and so fast that it'll happen irrespective of negligible feed-in rates. And if anything, I think it'll encourage consumers to shift their load into the middle times of the day, which is a shared benefit. It means we don't need to build as much storage.
Tony Webb, I appreciate you've been asked to talk on a particular aspect of the issue here tonight, but could you please comment on the fact that for many of us, all of this is going to be not achieving very much unless we do something about the way in which Australia is supplying the global market for a whole range of these products, particularly coal and gas. Could you please address that issue, and particularly, as you mentioned, the problem of getting enough investment? Could we not see a diversion or a closing down of all the subsidies going to coal and gas in this country and see those being diverted into the renewable energy systems? Could we not also see a clear indication from government that no further licences will be given for exploration or extraction of coal or gas in Australia, thereby sending a signal to the rest of the world that they need to get off their arse and do something about this? Could we not also see something in terms of the government using its foreign affairs powers and its export licensing arrangements to make sure that no export of coal or gas from this country goes to any other country that does not have comparable measures for limiting climate change in their own country, comparable to our own?
Okay, I'll briefly try to do this incredibly difficult public policy issue justice. We're a wealthy country with the world's 6th largest exporter of fossil fuels. When you add together the coking coal, the thermal coal and the gas that we export. We derive substantial royalties at a state level and royalties and income taxes at a federal level, which underpin many of the benefits we get. Of course, we know all that. From an economic and global citizen point of view, should we clamp down on those exports? People will have different views. It's a political and policy question. To some degree, it's an economic question. I can give you my views of the economics. I believe economically it would be a disadvantage to Australia, but globally, in the transition to cleaner fuels, it would be an advantage because you would take away one of the cheapest sources of fossil fuel energy. You'd drive up the clearing price. That has an effect on the market. Customers who are price sensitive will actually consume less. So I don't buy the stock standard political argument, if we don't do it, they will. That's the last argument, the last plausible argument, or it's not plausible argument. It's a argument that's wheeled out. It will drive prices up. It'll be detrimental to fossil fuels in aggregate globally. Will it have a detrimental economic impact, welfare impacts? It's not just Australian income distribution that should worry us. It's not just Australian welfare. On balance, I don't think so. I think it'll stimulate a transition in other countries. If anything, access to inexpensive fossil fuels doesn't become a distributional advantage abroad. Certainly in most countries that we sell coal to, which are rich countries, it is a disadvantage to them, and it's not helpful for the distribution of their wealth. So that's where I've landed on an economic consideration. But as I say, it's a political and policy issue, and it's, as you know, terribly vexed.
Thanks for your talk. I've just got a question about what you might see in terms of assisting industrial scale investment in solar. I'm on the board of the small cooperative wind farm, and we're getting euchred by the market at the moment because as it goes negative in the middle of the day, we're having to curtail. Yep. For the last 4 months, we've been at half production, and so that's not helping the dependence on coal. So I'm wondering, the question is, what sort of feed-in tariff or policy levers have you looked at, or might you recommend for government to encourage more large scale? Because we're also, we've got the connectors already and everything for a large scale battery up to 2 megawatts, up to 5 megawatts of solar, but the economic case isn't there at the moment. So that's the sort of thing we want to encourage, because it's far more economical probably than relying on individual rooftops, and it's got equity considerations as to who you could help in terms of the vulnerable sector with putting that into the grid.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, and this is my big policy push right now, is taking advantage of our commercial and industrial rooftop solar. The federal government has just announced a policy for large-scale wind and solar. Effectively, it swaps the short-term price, the 5-minute price, which is often zero when wind and solar is plentiful, for a fixed price. And so it takes that exposure away, and so you will get the new investment. I'm seeking to encourage governments to do exactly the same, not just for the big wind and solar distant, which brings with it these Western Victoria transmission lines, but also for the enormous potential we have on commercial and industrial warehouse solar. We have, as I said, far more rooftop solar potential on the warehouses and the factories in the 30-kilometre radiuses of our cities, and we're one of the most urbanised countries in the world, to meet the entire electrical demand of our grid. So if I was king for just one day, that would be the policy one that I would push. It's a little bit more difficult than big wind and solar in the sense that you need to orchestrate. You need to work with building owners, you need to get tenants on side, you need to bring in the electricity retailers. So it needs imagination and hard work and regulatory policy detail stuff. But absolutely, that is the policy. I wish the federal government had done this before, having done the large-scale stuff, but large-scale stuff is needed too.
Hello. A couple of quick questions. power. I'm interested in your views about the future or not of that. Second is there's capacity for residential dwellings, flats, units, apartments, public housing for solar and wind. Do you think we need a change in public policy on that? Is there any policy change coming forward that you're aware of? Again, interested in your opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, nuclear. Nuclear is a baseload electricity generation technology. It's a thermal technology, to be precise. What it does is it boils water in a container which makes steam. It does the same thing as a big coal-fired generator or a big gas generator. Big thermal generators have inertia. Their energy is stored in the water, which is translated into steam through a valve. That inertia makes them inflexible. So nuclear, like coal, is built to be put on and left on. How does that fit with an electrical system dominated by the wind and sun, which comes and goes stochastically when the wind and sun goes? The answer is it doesn't. Nuclear and wind and solar go together like electricity and water. They don't. So nuclear will not have a future in Australia unless Australia's governments say we are going to immediately put a moratorium on wind and solar expansion, and we are going to expropriate, whether they compensate or not, all of those households that have rooftop solar, and we're going to take electricity back and produce it centrally. So there is your policy, wealth distribution, economic difficulty in one. It's not going to happen in Australia, frankly, because nuclear as a technology is not nearly developed enough to present that compelling alternative. So that's the Australian situation as I see it. There is, however, potential for nuclear in cold countries, like much of the Northern Hemisphere, Canada, which have very large winter electrical demands for heating and very limited solar resource in winter for heating and seasonal variation in wind. So they don't have the energy advantages we have: roofs, wind, sun, land. So there is potential for it there, and indeed in many parts of Canada and the US and elsewhere, perfectly sensible people are saying we cannot have a transition without nuclear. And I think what they're saying for their circumstances is probably quite real. I think in Australia, the realpolitik of our transition already so far underway, the reality of our fantastic endowment of roofs, land, sun, wind, means we just don't need it. On your second question, rooftop solar in high-density buildings, it's in many of our high-density buildings, it's not a proposition. The ratio of roof space to floor space means your electrical production is simply too small. There's too little to go around. Even those where that's not the case, which are typically 5 stories or less, where you have relatively enough roof space to meet the demand of your building, you need to coordinate between often buildings which are partially owned and rented. You need to often come to an agreement through the owner's corporation. And then from an electrical point of view, you need to create the infrastructure to share the solar centrally produced on the roof with individual buildings. All of that adds enormous transaction cost and friction to the point at which the economic benefit is dissipated. So for many of those buildings, it's not a proposition. But when you look around in those communities, you don't have to go far to find a shopping centre or a warehouse or a bunch of shops whose roof space you can use. And it requires government to orchestrate between those roof space and the local consumers, perhaps with a battery or two in front of the meter or on the customer's premises to make that happen. Again, detailed implementation, transition, technical issue, but those are where the solutions lie. Our governments so far haven't quite got there. They've still tried to push the water uphill on wishing that somehow we can get rooftop solar on buildings and blaming the landlord-renter friction for it. Often it's not a landlord friction renter which is your critical problem, it's a physical building fabric issue which is your key problem. So The Vic government, I was asked to come to a launch in the morning, has launched a solar subsidy scheme which does a combination of deals with retailers and solar on buildings that they own and hence rent, which is starting to get there. But there is much more that we can do on that.
Hello. My first question relates to the last question on nuclear, but it's a very quick answer. In your graphs, when you were looking at clean energy overseas, were you including nuclear in that? But my main question is about the offshore wind projects that are about to be happening in the Bass Strait, and in the medium term and talking about future-proofing, are they going to look at the ginormous levels in sea rise that will actually be seen?
Okay, in my charts, nuclear was not included. So France, which has got 85% of its power from nuclear, had very little as a proportion clean energy because there's not much space for it. So nuclear hadn't been included. It was just clean energies. On your second question, can you jog my memory again, please? Oh, sorry, excuse me. So you got it. I don't know what the engineers have done on sea level rise for the offshore wind farms that they have in mind. Often those wind farms are attached to the sea floor through cables, which can be lengthened. So potentially rapid sea level change can actually be adjusted. There is also increasingly floating wind farms. They're a great deal more expensive, but that might change.
Hi there, thank you so much for the question. I was just going to ask, with the rise of solar panels on urban structures, the inevitable sort of shift in dynamic between homeowners and renters, as not just consumers, but now producers in the energy market, how do you believe we as both individuals can both publicly and privately make the case for the democratization of our energy economy with the inevitable pushback from entrenched institutions and players from the power market?
Yeah, very good question. The politics of energy. I was quite despondent after reading the Stern Review back in 2006, which was my Damascene conversion, for want of a better word, and that's when I decided to orient my career around the energy transition. I thought these vested interests are just too powerful. There's two things that have brought about the change. Firstly, rooftop solar has been taken up by voters. And there were two political attempts, one in Western Australia and another in Sydney, about 5 to 10 years ago now, where Liberal governments sought to undo rooftop solar on the urging of the energy industry, the large players who saw this as a threat. And they sought to clamp down on rooftop solar and they got their noses well and truly bloodied. And since then, politicians of left and right dare say boo to rooftop solar. So technology change taken up by the voting public has been a fantastic force. And personally, I think it's just the most wonderful thing because it's a source of clean energy, which is in the customer's interests, that has positive distributional impacts. Roughly 14 billion of public money has been used to subsidise rooftop solar, but that's leveraged $38 billion of private money from people who've invested their own money in that. Sure, they've obtained a benefit from it. They are ahead. The investment has paid for itself. But the price effect of that rooftop solar has driven down prices in the market and brought down prices for all and created fantastic opportunities for everyone. So these godsend technologies can undo these incredibly powerful vested interests to the point now that I would say they are powerless. If anything, governments are trying to strengthen them because they're terribly worried about the lights going out. They haven't actually prepared for the energy transition.
Just one question. What do you suggest is most needed in terms of public policy to enable older apartments to upgrade to support charging of electric vehicles? Our body corporate is facing this question already. When we edge come to replacing our cars, we need to go electric. How can we do this?
Oh gosh, all of the tricky issues. So I've got personal experience of this in a flat that I owned and rented out. Prior to buying it, it was an off-the-plan development. I asked the developer to ensure that there was a charging point in proximity to the underground parking space that was available, which they did. I was then on the Owners Corporation Committee, and I thought it would be terribly unfair if my tenants they didn't have an EV, but should a future tenant come in and plug an EV in, that they consumed the body corporate's electricity. And so I said it's important that we put together, as an owner corporation, a policy for charging these consumers access to the shared electricity. And if we don't do that, it'll be an impediment to people putting in EVs or considering buying EVs. And that would be an impediment to the other tenants in the building, which would be unfair on them, slow down the transition and deprive them of opportunities that people with driveways had. Well, the rest of the Owners Corporation wouldn't have a bar of it. No, all too hard, all too complex. I'd come up with a formula saying how much, how we should run this scheme. All too difficult, don't want to know. So what can be done? I think governments coming up with a template Owners Corporation agreement on access to charging within a building. Governments reaching into the public purse to subsidise the strengthening of the electrical infrastructure in a building to establish charging points, and a policy to upgrade local substations. I think this is, again, one of these difficult implementation issues, but vital for a transition so that tenants and owners will not have the disadvantage of not being able to transition equitably. So a strong case for government organisation, but just think how hard these things are. It's not just an energy policy issue now. Now it's a planning minister issue and a local government issue and a council versus state government issue, and on it goes. So, but that's what government should do.
I actually got the last question, lucky. And I know that we are actually perhaps abusing of your generosity and of your knowledge of so many questions. So feel free to answer as yes or no, okay? So a recent Oxfam report that came out last week says that the richest 1% of people are responsible for as much carbon output as the poorest 66%. It also says that millionaires alone are on track to burn 72% of the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So the questions that you can answer as yes or no if you prefer are, is this being taken into account, this inequity, in the policies that we have here in Australia and the policies in the world? And second, is your opinion that this should be taken into account or not?
I absolutely think it should. Is it? I would say by and large, no. A bunch of global organisations, the IEA and the IMF, tussle with each other as to whether the value of our fossil fuel subsidies are $2 trillion or $3 trillion a year. Those are our fossil fuel subsidies. When you dig into it, each of those countries that have the fossil fuel subsidies, the industry will argue, well, you're subsidising the less well-off to ensure access to heating and to electricity. And often it's hard to argue with that. Some of that access to energy is subsidising and is extending electricity access to low-income people. The part of the argument they won't tell you is the money they're making in the process of this thing that is being subsidised. So it's true on both ends. And so how do you undo it? Well, these are classical economic and public policy problems. Clean energy, luckily, is much harder to monopolise because it is diffuse and it is from a freely available resource and it can be decentralised. So technology is helping that. I wish I could have ever have done something meaningful in stopping those enormous subsidies of fossils. I don't think there's anything I can do in a policy sense, but in a technology sense, we can be glad that these clean energy technologies are doing a lot of the heavy lifting where governments have failed. Thank you. Thank you very much for your question.